A leader is not measured by power, but by what he is willing to give up. Enjoy listening.
Zero Mari.
I've reviewed the projections, and I'm confident that our approach will yield the results we discussed.
The data supports this direction. We are moving forward decisively, and I expect everyone to align with the new strategy immediately.
Our strategy must adapt to the evolving landscape. By integrating these insights, we can redefine our approach.
This is where we stand. Whatever happens next, it has to be your decision.
Let's focus on the families coming down from the ridge first. Make sure they all get fitted for the winter coats.
Before we begin tonight's story, I want to invite you to slow down, take a breath, let the noise of the day settle for a moment. This is not just a romance. It is a story about dignity, choice, and what it truly means to protect someone when you have the power not to. Sometimes the most important moments in life happen far away from boardrooms, far away from applause, in places where no one is watching. If you believe stories should leave you thinking long after they end, please take a second to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our new releases. It is quick, it is free, and it truly helps us continue creating meaningful stories like this. And before we begin, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let us return to our main character. Her name is Elena Carter. She did not join the company's mountain outreach program for attention. She joined because she believed work should mean something beyond quarterly profits. The company, led by its billionaire founder, Daniel Whitmore, sponsored a week-long humanitarian initiative in a rural Appalachian town. Temporary medical stations, infrastructure repairs, education workshops. It looked good on corporate reports, but for Elena, it was personal. She grew up in a town not much different from this one. She knew what it meant to live paycheck to paycheck. She knew what it meant to watch a parent choose between medication and groceries. Independence to her was never arrogance. It was survival. Independence is not pride. It is protection. On the third morning of the program, before the volunteers gathered for the day's assignments, Elena walked down a quiet trail behind the temporary housing cabins. She needed a moment alone. The air was crisp. Early sunlight filtered through the trees. A small natural spring ran nearby the water, steady and clear. She believed she was alone. Daniel Whitmore believed the same. He had stepped away from the press and the cameras, from the endless polite conversations, needing silence more than admiration. When they turned the corner of the same narrow path at nearly the same time, they both froze. It was not scandalous. It was not dramatic. It was human. Elena stood there, startled, vulnerable, in a way she had not planned to be, in front of the most powerful man in the company. Daniel stopped immediately, turning his gaze away out of instinct, not calculation. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "I did not realize anyone else came back here." His tone was calm, controlled, respectful. In that moment, Elena understood something unexpected. Power reveals itself in small gestures. He could have stared. He could have laughed. He could have used charm to dismiss the tension. He did none of that. He stepped back, creating distance. Leadership is not proven when everyone is watching. It is proven when restraint costs you nothing but ego. They parted without further words. No witnesses, no explanation. Just a brief encounter that neither of them would mention publicly. But something had shifted. For Elena, the shift was not romantic. It was unsettling. She had built her career on avoiding dependency. She had worked twice as hard to ensure no one could say she benefited from proximity to power. Now she carried a private moment with the one man whose decisions could shape her professional future. For Daniel, the moment lingered differently. He had spent years constructing an image of decisive authority, yet the most honest version of himself had appeared not in a boardroom, but on a quiet mountain trail. Neither of them knew it then, but that morning would become the first test of whether integrity is a principle or a performance. The rest of that week in the mountains moved forward as if nothing unusual had happened. Elena returned to her assigned station, coordinating supply distribution for families who had driven nearly 40 miles for assistance. She tracked inventory, redirected volunteers, and made certain no child left without proper winter clothing. Her movements were efficient. Her tone was steady. Outwardly, she was unchanged. Inwardly, she was recalibrating. When you grow up without safety nets, you learn to scan every situation for risk. Not emotional risk, structural risk. Daniel Whitmore remained visible throughout the program, but always at a distance. He spoke with local officials. He helped unload equipment. He avoided cameras more than he sought them. If their eyes met across a crowded field or temporary clinic tent, neither of them held the gaze for long. There was no private conversation, no follow-up acknowledgement, and that silence began to matter. On the fourth evening, a regional news crew arrived unexpectedly. Word had spread that the billionaire founder himself was spending the week on site. Cameras rolled, questions sharpened. The narrative shifted from community service to corporate image. Elena stood behind a folding table stacked with medical kits when she overheard one reporter say, "It is refreshing to see leadership this hands-on." She glanced toward Daniel. He did not smile for the cameras. He did not deliver polished lines about corporate responsibility. Instead, he redirected the microphone toward the local project coordinator, a middle-aged woman who had organized relief efforts long before corporate funding arrived. "This is her work," Daniel said. "We are supporting it." It was a small correction, but Elena noticed. Real leadership does not compete for credit. It redistributes it. Later that night, a closed-door strategy meeting was held inside one of the larger temporary cabins. Senior managers joined by video call. Risk assessments were discussed, liability exposure, brand optics. Elena was not supposed to be there, but as the logistics coordinator for on-site operations, she was asked to provide data. She entered quietly and took a seat near the end of the table. Daniel acknowledged her presence with a brief nod. Nothing more. The conversation shifted when one executive on the call raised a concern. "We need to ensure clear boundaries between leadership and staff during these retreats. The last thing we need is speculation." The word lingered. Speculation. No one mentioned names. No one referenced the trail behind the cabins. But Elena felt heat rise under her collar. She had done nothing wrong. Neither had he. Yet perception, she knew, often outran truth. Daniel's response was measured. "Boundaries are non-negotiable," he said. "And accountability begins with leadership." He did not elaborate. He did not defend himself preemptively. He simply moved the meeting forward, but Elena heard what was beneath the words. When a leader publicly affirms boundaries, he is either protecting someone or protecting himself. Sometimes it is both. That night, Elena lay awake in her narrow bunk, listening to wind move through the trees outside the cabin walls. She thought about her mother's medical bills, about the promotion she had been quietly working toward, about how fragile upward mobility can be when rumor enters the room before you do. She did not fear Daniel. She feared imbalance. If her name were ever attached to his in the wrong context, it would not be his reputation questioned first. It would be hers. This is the truth we rarely admit. Power absorbs impact differently, depending on who carries it. The next morning, as volunteers gathered for assignments, Daniel approached her station briefly. Not close enough to draw attention, not distant enough to seem evasive. "Thank you for keeping operations steady," he said in a tone identical to the one he used with every team lead. "Professional." "Neutral," she nodded. "That is my job." And for a brief second, something unspoken passed between them. Not attraction, not even trust, recognition. They both understood that whatever had happened on that quiet trail was no longer just a private moment. It was a test, and the real question had not yet been asked. By the time the outreach program ended, the mountains felt quieter than when they had arrived. Volunteers packed equipment into trucks. Temporary tents were dismantled. Families waved as the last medical supplies were distributed. It looked from a distance like a successful initiative. Numbers would confirm it. Press coverage would highlight it. But success is not always measured in reports. On the final afternoon, Elena stood alone near the edge of the field where the cabins had been. The narrow trail behind them was visible in the distance, almost ordinary now. If someone had walked past it, they would never guess it carried the weight it did. Daniel Whitmore was across the clearing, speaking with the local coordinator one last time. His posture remained calm, deliberate. There was no theatrical farewell, no self-congratulatory tone. He shook hands, listened more than he spoke, and thanked the team by name. Elena watched carefully, not because she was drawn to him, but because she was studying him. When you come from scarcity, you learn to study power the way others study opportunity. You do not romanticize it, you analyze it. As the final truck engine started, Daniel approached her for the first time since the brief exchange at her station that morning. "Good work this week," he said. His voice carried the same professional cadence as before. No softness, no coded language. "You as well," she replied. There was a pause, but not an uncomfortable one. It felt more like a checkpoint. "I want to be clear," he continued, lowering his voice slightly so it did not carry beyond them. "If at any point you feel this week created discomfort or risk for you, I expect to know." The words were precise, not defensive, not apologetic, accountable. Elena held his gaze steady. "There is no risk if boundaries remain intact." He nodded once. "They will." It was not a promise of emotion, it was a promise of structure. This is where most stories would turn romantic, but real life does not pivot on glances. It pivots on policies. The drive back to the city took nearly 3 hours. Elena sat in the passenger seat of a company vehicle with 2 other volunteers watching the mountains fade into highways and concrete. Her phone buzzed halfway through the trip. An email from corporate headquarters. Subject line, strategic realignment, leadership oversight. Her pulse slowed, not quickened. Experience had taught her that corporate language often masked something else. She opened it. Effective immediately, all outreach initiatives would operate under a newly formed independent oversight committee. Direct reporting lines between executive leadership and field staff would be minimized. Transparency protocols would increase. It was not addressed to her personally, but it had her fingerprints on it. Daniel had moved first. Accountability is not what you say in private, it is what you formalize in public. Elena leaned back against the seat, letting the implications settle. He had not waited for rumor. He had not waited for accusation. He had shifted the structure before speculation could define it, and yet something in her remained unsettled, because structural change did not erase perception. By the time they reached the city skyline, notifications had begun appearing on internal messaging platforms. Colleagues congratulated leadership on strengthening ethical safeguards. Some speculated about what prompted the adjustment. The word from the meeting lingered again in her mind. Speculation? When she returned to her apartment that evening, she placed her volunteer badge on the kitchen counter and stood in silence for a long moment. Her career trajectory had always been linear. Work hard, stay disciplined, avoid entanglement, earn every advancement. Now there was a variable she had not planned for. Not attraction, not scandal, but visibility. Visibility is dangerous when you have not chosen it, especially when someone more powerful stands in the same frame. Across town, Daniel stood in his high-rise office overlooking the city. He read the same internal messages. He understood how quickly narrative could form around incomplete information. He had built his company on transparency, but transparency alone could not neutralize imbalance. The mountain trail had revealed something neither of them expected. Not romance, responsibility, and responsibility once acknowledged demands action. The week in the mountains was over. The real test was about to begin. The city felt different after the mountains. Not louder, not colder, just sharper. Elena returned to headquarters on Monday morning to find her inbox fuller than usual. Internal memos about the new oversight structure continued to circulate. Calendar invitations appeared for compliance briefings and ethics reviews. No one mentioned her name, but more than one colleague looked at her a second longer than before. She kept her routine steady. Coffee at 8:15, desk organized by 8:20, review reports before 10. If there was going to be scrutiny, she would meet it with discipline. When attention finds you unexpectedly, the only defense is consistency. At 11 o'clock, a message from executive administration appeared on her screen. Daniel Whitmore requested a one-on-one debrief regarding the outreach program. The wording was neutral. Her pulse remained steady. She walked into the executive conference room exactly on time. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline. The table between them was wide enough to remind anyone of hierarchy. Daniel stood when she entered. "Thank you for coming," he said. She nodded. "You asked for data analysis from the field. He gestured toward the chair across from him. Yes, and perspective. The conversation began with logistics, supply gaps, volunteer retention, budget allocation. Elena spoke clearly without hesitation. She did not soften her critiques. When she believed a decision could have been more efficient, she said so. Daniel listened without interruption. Not once did he reference the trail. Not once did he allude to speculation. After nearly 40 minutes, the discussion slowed. I am aware, he said carefully, that structural changes often create assumptions. There it was. Not an accusation, not a confession, an acknowledgement. Elena met his gaze. Assumptions are rarely about facts. They are about power. A flicker of recognition crossed his expression. You believe the adjustment was necessary, he said. Yes, she replied. But necessity does not erase perception. He leaned back slightly, considering her words. My father once told me that control is proof of leadership, he said quietly. He believed if people questioned your authority, you tightened it. Elena did not respond immediately. And I spent years undoing that lesson, he continued. Because control without trust breeds silence, not respect. The admission was not dramatic. It was measured, deliberate. Healing does not begin with romance. It begins with truth about where you learned your power. Daniel folded his hands on the table. I will not allow your career to carry weight that belongs to my position, he said. If additional measures are required, they will be implemented. The phrasing mattered. He did not say, I will protect you. He said, I will adjust the structure. Elena felt something shift, not in her feelings, but in her evaluation. You cannot prevent speculation entirely, she said, but you can ensure it never influences advancement. He nodded. That is already being reviewed. Silence followed, not strained, but intentional. Outside the glass walls of the conference room, employees moved through hallways, unaware of the conversation unfolding inside. Inside, two people sat across from one another, not as romantic leads, but as participants in a fragile ethical equation. Elena rose first. If my performance ever falls below standard, she said evenly, I expect to be measured by the same criteria as anyone else. You will, Daniel replied. And if it exceeds standard, the same applies. She paused at the door. For what it is worth, she added, I do not question your intention. He held her gaze. Intention is not enough. That is the difference between image and integrity. Image defends intention. Integrity redesigns behavior. When she left the room, Elena understood something new. The mountain trail had not created tension between them. It had exposed a tension already built into the structure around them. Across town, headlines about the company's new ethical oversight framework began appearing on business blogs. Analysts praised the proactive transparency. No one mentioned a quiet trail in Appalachia. No one mentioned Elena Carter. But she knew. The real transformation was not in public relations. It was in whether both of them would continue choosing restraint when emotion inevitably complicated the equation. Because it would. And when it did, policy alone would not be enough. By midweek, the structural changes Daniel initiated began to ripple through the company in ways neither of them could fully control. An internal compliance bulletin was released outlining updated reporting hierarchies. Executive leaders would no longer have direct performance oversight of employees involved in philanthropic initiatives. Independent review panels would handle advancement evaluations for those divisions. On paper, it looked like a progressive reform. In hallways, it looked like a story waiting to be written. Elena felt the shift first in silence. Conversations paused when she entered shared spaces. Laughter softened. Screens tilted slightly away. No one confronted her directly. No one accused her of anything, but distance can be louder than confrontation. When perception shifts, you feel it in the air before you hear it in words. At lunch one afternoon, a colleague she had worked beside for 2 years leaned across the table and asked casually, Do you know what triggered the new oversight committee? The tone was light. The implication was not. Elena met her gaze without flinching. Corporate ethics evolve. That is usually a good sign. It was a clean answer, controlled, professional. But she understood something deeper in that moment. The reform that was meant to protect fairness had created curiosity. Curiosity was fertile ground for narrative, and narrative rarely favors the less powerful party. Across the building, Daniel sat in a quarterly strategy session with board members. Financial projections were discussed, expansion plans debated. Yet one board member redirected the conversation. The compliance adjustment was bold, the man said. Proactive, but it suggests vulnerability. Daniel did not react outwardly. Transparency is not vulnerability, he replied. It is insulation. The board member studied him for a moment longer than necessary. Let us hope the market reads it that way. After the meeting, Daniel remained seated alone in the conference room. He had spent years building the company's reputation on principled leadership. Yet now he faced a subtler challenge. Not financial, not operational, reputational ambiguity. The higher you rise, the more your decisions are interpreted as strategy rather than character. Later that afternoon, Elena received a formal notice. Her upcoming promotion review would be conducted by the newly formed independent panel rather than her original executive supervisor. The language emphasized impartiality, objectivity, reinforced standards. It was meant to reassure, instead it unsettled her. Not because she doubted her competence. She had earned every metric attached to her performance, but because she understood timing. The review was scheduled earlier than expected. She closed her office door and allowed herself one honest thought. If this promotion were denied, no one would say it was connected to Daniel. They would say she lacked readiness. They would cite data points. And if it were approved, some would still attribute it to proximity. This is the quiet burden of structural imbalance. Even fairness can feel suspect when context is charged. That evening, as employees filtered out of the building, Elena stayed behind to finalize reports for the review panel. She documented every initiative she had led, every measurable improvement, every cost-saving adjustment, not to impress, to fortify. Across town, Daniel drafted a memo to the board clarifying long-term governance reforms. He did not mention Elena's name. He did not mention the mountain trail. He framed the changes as part of a broader ethical modernization plan. Because in truth they were. But truth rarely travels alone. It travels with interpretation. When Elena stepped into the elevator that night, she caught her reflection in the mirrored wall. She looked composed. She did not look threatened. Yet beneath that composure was a new awareness. The moment on the trail had not endangered her reputation. The response to it might. And the coming review would not simply measure performance, it would measure whether integrity could survive suspicion. Healing begins when someone chooses accountability. Justice begins when systems are tested under pressure. The question now was not whether Daniel had acted responsibly. It was whether the structure he created would protect her when scrutiny intensified. Because it would. The morning of Elena's promotion review arrived without ceremony. No announcement, no visible tension in the office corridors. Just another Wednesday on the calendar, marked with a 30-minute block labeled Independent Panel Evaluation. She dressed deliberately that day, not to impress, not to signal anything beyond competence. A tailored navy blazer, neutral blouse, hair pulled back cleanly, no unnecessary detail. When the ground beneath you feels uncertain, precision becomes armor. The review was held in a smaller executive room, neutral and windowless. 3 panel members sat across from her, none of whom had direct reporting lines to Daniel Whitmore. That was the point. Impartiality. At least in structure. They began with metrics. Community initiative, impact growth. Cost reduction percentages. Employee retention improvements in her division. Elena answered each question without hesitation, providing context where necessary but never embellishing. Then one panel member shifted slightly in his chair. There has been notable structural change in leadership oversight recently, he said evenly. Do you believe that has influenced your visibility within the company? The question was polished. The subtext was not. Elena held his gaze. I believe structural clarity benefits everyone, she replied. My performance metrics were documented prior to those changes and remain measurable regardless of them. Another panel member leaned forward. And your working relationship with Mr. Whitmore? The room seemed smaller, professional silence settled. It is consistent with executive leadership engagement, she said calmly, focused on outcomes, accountable to policy. There was no defensiveness in her tone, only restraint. Integrity is not proven when you defend yourself emotionally. It is proven when you answer calmly under suspicion. The review ended exactly on schedule. No expressions gave anything away. No immediate feedback was offered. Elena walked out with the same measured pace she had walked in with. Across the building, Daniel received a brief update from corporate governance confirming the panel had concluded. He did not request details. He did not attempt to influence outcome. That was the agreement he had made with himself. Later that afternoon, Elena's phone vibrated. Promotion approved. Effective next quarter, she would step into a regional strategic operations role. Increased responsibility, increased visibility, increased scrutiny. She exhaled once, controlled. This was what she had worked toward for years, and yet instead of relief, a quiet awareness settled in. Approval did not silence perception. Within hours, congratulatory messages began appearing in her inbox. Most were sincere. A few felt carefully worded. One message stood out. From Daniel Whitmore, subject line congratulations. The email was brief. Your work stands on its own. Well done. No exclamation point, no personal tone, no unnecessary language. She read it twice. He had chosen distance again. Not avoidance. Discipline. Sometimes love does not look like closeness. It looks like space intentionally preserved. That evening, as Elena packed her bag to leave, she noticed two colleagues speaking softly near the elevators. When they saw her approach, the conversation ended. She did not slow down, because she understood something clearly now. Promotion did not eliminate suspicion. It amplified it. Across town, Daniel stood alone in his office, city lights reflecting against the glass. He had done what was structurally correct. He had removed oversight. He had formalized distance. He had allowed an independent panel to determine outcome. And still, he knew the imbalance remained. Because power is not erased by policy. It is only redirected. The question no longer centered on whether Elena earned her advancement. She had. The question was whether both of them could continue choosing restraint as proximity increased through success rather than controversy. Healing is not a single act of reform. It is a series of disciplined choices repeated when emotion grows stronger. Elena stepped into the elevator and watched the numbers descend. The mountain trail felt far away now, but the lesson it revealed had only deepened. Integrity had survived the first test. The next one would not be structural. It would be personal. The promotion announcement settled into the company culture like a stone dropped into still water. The surface returned to calm quickly. The ripples did not. Elena's new role placed her in charge of regional strategic operations across 3 states. It meant travel, budget authority, cross-departmental coordination. It also meant more frequent executive briefings, including quarterly strategy sessions where Daniel Whitmore would be present. The first of those sessions arrived sooner than expected. She entered the executive boardroom as a peer contributor, not a subordinate. The shift in seating arrangement alone signaled change. She was no longer at the far end of the table taking notes. She now presented projections, proposed expansions, challenged assumptions. Daniel listened without interruption. Not once did he over-explain her points. Not once did he rescue her from pushback. When one senior vice president questioned her projected cost savings model, Daniel remained silent until she finished responding. And she responded well. After the meeting, as executives filtered out, the same vice president approached her privately. "You handled that challenge professionally," he said. "I will admit I was skeptical." Elena nodded. "Skepticism is reasonable. Assumptions are not." The man paused, then offered a brief, respectful nod before leaving. Competence does not eliminate doubt immediately. It erodes it over time. Across the room, Daniel observed the exchange but did not intervene. Later that evening, a closed session of the board convened without Elena present. Governance topics. Long-term leadership structure. Succession planning. One board member raised an issue directly. "The restructuring you implemented," she said to Daniel, "has strengthened compliance optics. But there remains perception risk tied to executive proximity with high-performing staff." Daniel did not deflect. "I am aware," he said, "which is why I am proposing an additional adjustment." He outlined a voluntary recusal from direct strategic oversight of Elena's division. Not because policy required it, because perception demanded insulation beyond minimum standards. The room grew quiet. "That is unnecessary," another member said. "The oversight committee already exists." Daniel's answer was steady. Necessary and sufficient are not the same. He did not mention Elena by name again, but the implication was clear. Love, when it begins to form in complicated spaces, must be measured not by emotion, but by what you are willing to relinquish. 2 days later, Elena received formal notice. Her division would report directly to the chief operating officer rather than to Daniel in strategic alignment matters. Executive interactions would occur only in multi-member settings. It was a further layer of distance. She read the memo carefully. Then she requested a brief meeting. They met in a glass conference room late in the afternoon. Sunlight cast long shadows across the polished table. "You recused yourself," she said evenly. "Yes," Daniel replied. "You did not have to." "I did." She studied him for a long moment. "This makes your position weaker," she said. "It makes the structure stronger," he answered. Silence settled between them. She understood the weight of what he had done. Executive authorities rarely surrendered voluntarily, even in small increments. Why, she asked quietly. His answer did not come immediately. "Because intention is invisible," he said. "Structure is not." She felt something shift inside her. Not attraction, not yet. Respect. There is a difference between someone who protects you emotionally and someone who protects your dignity institutionally. The second is rare. Outside that room, speculation had not disappeared. It had simply grown more cautious. With each structural adjustment, it became harder to attach narrative to their names. Harder, not impossible. Elena returned to her office that evening with a clarity she had not felt before. The mountain trail had introduced tension. The boardroom had transformed it into principle. Across town, Daniel stood once again at his office window, city lights stretching outward. He had surrendered proximity. He had absorbed scrutiny. He had reduced his own authority in measurable ways. Not for romance, for fairness. And fairness, when chosen repeatedly, begins to change the nature of what might one day grow between two people. The question was no longer whether they felt something unspoken. The question was whether that feeling would survive restraint. Because healing does not remove desire, it refines it. And the next decision would demand even more than structural reform. Elena's transition into her new role did not come with celebration. It came with expectation. Her first month as Regional Strategic Operations Director was measured in miles traveled and decisions made under pressure. She visited distribution centers in Ohio. She reviewed community partnerships in Kentucky. She renegotiated supplier contracts in Western Pennsylvania. Each visit carried the same quiet test. Were her results sustainable? Not whether she deserved the role, whether she could redefine it. True empowerment is not proven the day you are promoted. It is proven the first time you succeed without proximity to power. Daniel kept his distance. Quarterly executive sessions continued, but they were structured, formal, multi-member, transparent. He never scheduled one-on-one meetings. He never inserted himself into her division's strategy calls. The recusal had not been symbolic. It had been absolute. At first, Elena wondered whether the silence meant retreat. Then she began to see something else. Space is uncomfortable when you are used to tension, but space can also be respect. One evening after returning from a 2-day site audit, Elena received an invitation to speak at a national ethics in leadership conference. Her recent operational reforms had attracted attention. A journalist had written about the company's governance transformation, highlighting how structural accountability strengthened performance metrics. Her name was included. Not Daniel's. She accepted. 2 months later, she stood behind a podium in Chicago, facing an audience of executives, nonprofit leaders, and graduate students. She spoke about operational transparency, about separating authority from evaluation processes, about building systems that protect both productivity and dignity. She did not mention the mountain trail. She did not mention Daniel. She did not need to. After the session, a young woman approached her. "How did you gain that level of trust from executive leadership?" she asked. Elena paused. "It was not given," she said. "It was structured. When trust is institutionalized rather than personalized, it becomes sustainable." Across the country, Daniel watched a recording of her keynote, alone in his office. He did not smile broadly. He did not react outwardly, but he understood what it meant. She was no longer navigating suspicion. She was shaping discourse, and she was doing it independently. Later that quarter, the company's board reviewed performance reports. Elena's division outperformed projections by 12%. Employee retention improved. Community partnerships expanded. A board member turned to Daniel. The recusal did not hinder results, she said. No, Daniel replied. It strengthened them. He did not elaborate. He did not claim influence. He understood that influence, when ethical, sometimes means stepping back. Meanwhile, whispers within the company had shifted tone. Where once there had been curiosity and cautious distance, there was now recognition. Elena's presentations were requested by other departments. Her models were replicated. Speculation faded, not because it was silenced, because it was disproven. Reputation does not heal through defense. It heals through sustained evidence. One evening, months after the mountains, Elena found herself back in the city late after work. She stepped onto the rooftop terrace outside her building, the skyline stretching wide and bright before her. Her phone vibrated. A simple message from Daniel. Your keynote was measured and clear. Congratulations. No additional commentary, no personal overtone. She stared at the message for a moment before replying. Thank you, nothing more. It was not avoidance, it was equilibrium. She understood now that whatever existed between them would never be built on secrecy or urgency. If it grew, it would grow in daylight. Healing does not remove desire, it transforms it into patience. Across the city, Daniel set his phone down and looked out over the skyline. He had surrendered oversight, he had absorbed scrutiny. He had watched her rise without interference, and in doing so, something between them had changed. It was no longer defined by imbalance, it was defined by earned distance. The mountain trail felt distant now, almost symbolic. What began as a moment of vulnerability had become a lesson in reform. But reform alone does not close a story. Soon circumstances would bring them into the same room again. Not as executive and rising talent, but as equals in a conversation neither of them had allowed themselves to begin. 3 quarters after the Mountain Outreach Program, the company hosted its annual Governance and Strategy Summit in New York. Unlike previous years, this summit carried a different tone: ethical restructuring, independent oversight, institutional reform. Analysts and industry leaders had taken notice. What began as a quiet compliance adjustment had become a case study. Elena was invited as a featured panelist, not as a rising manager, as an architect of operational reform. When she entered the main ballroom that morning, the atmosphere felt professional, composed, almost ceremonial. Long tables draped in white linen, soft lighting, executives and policy advisors seated in careful rows. Daniel Whitmore stood near the front of the room, speaking with members of the board. He wore the same measured expression he carried into every public setting: calm, focused, guarded. Their eyes met only briefly. No hesitation, no tension, only acknowledgement. There is a quiet strength that emerges when two people no longer owe each other protection. Elena's panel focused on institutional accountability. She spoke clearly about separating influence from evaluation processes. She outlined how independence in governance does not weaken leadership, but refines it. After the session concluded, the audience applauded not with spectacle, but with respect. Later that afternoon, during a break between sessions, Elena stepped onto an outdoor terrace overlooking the city skyline. The air was cool. The noise of Manhattan drifted upward in muted layers. She did not hear Daniel approach. "I appreciated your clarity today," he said. She turned composed. "I appreciated your restraint months ago." There was no defensiveness in either voice, only recognition. They stood side by side, facing the skyline rather than each other. "I did not know," Daniel began carefully, "whether distance would create resentment." "It created credibility," she replied. He nodded once. "I have considered stepping further back from operational leadership," he continued, transitioning toward long-term governance and mentorship. This was not casual conversation. This was trajectory. Elena studied him for a moment. "Because of perception, because of evolution," he answered. "The company no longer needs centralized authority to function ethically." Silence stretched between them, but it was not uncomfortable. It was measured. "For what it is worth," she said quietly, "I no longer measure my progress against proximity." He looked at her, then fully. "And for what it is worth," he replied, "I no longer fear losing authority to protect fairness." The statement held weight. Not romantic weight, moral weight. Healing is complete not when tension disappears, but when fear no longer dictates behavior. They walked slowly along the terrace, careful to maintain visible space between them. Anyone observing would see two executives in discussion. Nothing more. "I do not want secrecy," Elena said finally. "Nor do I," Daniel replied. "I do not want narrative to define us." "Nor do I." Another pause. "Then whatever exists," she said, choosing her words deliberately, "must exist in daylight." He did not rush to answer. Agreed. No hand reached across the space between them. No dramatic confession unfolded. Instead, something steadier settled. Possibility without imbalance. Across the ballroom, attendees began returning to their seats for the closing address. Before they re-entered, Daniel spoke once more. "If we choose to explore this," he said, voice low, but certain it will be after the full transition of leadership oversight is complete. She nodded. "That is the only way it works. Timing does not correct imbalance. Structure does. And once structure is corrected, timing becomes honest." As they stepped back inside, applause rose for the final keynote speaker. From a distance, they appeared composed, separate, professional. But something fundamental had shifted. The mountain trail had exposed vulnerability. The boardroom had demanded reform. The months of restraint had forged credibility. Now, for the first time, the possibility between them did not threaten fairness. It honored it. And the final decision would not be about risk. It would be about readiness. The leadership transition was announced 6 weeks after the Governance and Strategy Summit. It was not framed as a resignation. It was framed as evolution. Daniel Whitmore would step back from direct executive oversight and move into a long-term governance and advisory role. Day-to-day operational authority would be formally transferred to the Chief Operating Officer and the executive team. The announcement was detailed, transparent, structured. There was no ambiguity. Elena read the internal memo from her office, the city skyline visible beyond her window. She did not feel shock. She felt recognition. This had never been about optics alone. It had been about alignment. True leadership is proven when you are willing to relinquish power not because you failed, but because the structure no longer requires your dominance. The following quarter unfolded without disruption. Performance metrics remained strong. Shareholder confidence held steady. Analysts praised the smooth transition as an example of disciplined governance. Speculation, once persistent, dissolved under sustained evidence. And in that space of stability, something else became possible. One evening, nearly a year after the Mountain Outreach Program, Elena received an invitation, not to a boardroom, not to a strategy session, to a public charity event hosted by the company's independent foundation. The invitation was formal, transparent, open attendance. She accepted. The event was held in a renovated historic building overlooking the Hudson River. Soft lighting reflected off glass walls. Conversations flowed easily between executives, nonprofit leaders, and community partners. Daniel stood near the center of the room, no longer positioned as the singular authority figure, but as one voice among many. When he saw her approach, he did not step forward immediately. He allowed space. He allowed context. Then, when it was natural, he greeted her. "You look well," he said. "So do you," she replied. They spoke about foundation initiatives, about long-term impact strategies, about how governance reforms had improved employee retention and external trust. The conversation did not rush toward emotion. It moved through alignment. Later, they stepped onto a balcony overlooking the river. The air was cool. The city lights shimmered in the distance. There were people nearby, conversations within earshot. Nothing hidden. "Elena," he began carefully, "I have spent the past year ensuring that any future decision between us would never compromise your position." She studied him quietly. "The structure is clear," she said. "Oversight is separate. Authority is distributed." He nodded. "I do not want gratitude," he continued. "I want equality." Silence settled, not tense, but honest. "I do not want rescue," she said. "I want choice." Their eyes met, steady and unguarded. Love that emerges after reform does not feel reckless. It feels earned. There was no dramatic confession, no grand gesture, only clarity. "If we move forward," Daniel said, "it will be public, it will be patient, and it will never interfere with your independence." She considered his words. For the first time, she replied, "There is nothing to interfere with." He extended his hand, not possessively, but openly. She took it, not as a dependent, not as an employee, as an equal. Inside the building, laughter and music continued. Outside, the river moved steadily beneath the night sky. The mountain trail that began their story felt distant, now almost symbolic. What once revealed vulnerability had revealed something far more important: character. Integrity is not a single decision. It is a pattern of choices made when it would be easier not to. They did not rush into declarations. They did not promise forever beneath the city lights. They chose something steadier, a beginning grounded in structure, respect, and visibility. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson. Healing is not about avoiding complicated circumstances. It is about transforming them into environments where dignity survives, where power yields to fairness, and where love, when it finally arrives, does not threaten justice. It strengthens it.
Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end. If this story touched you, more of my most gripping stories are already waiting on your screen. Click one now. I promise you're going to love it. See you in the next one.